Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at a really specific section of a document Exhibit 4. We're focusing in on pages 288 through 345.
Yeah, that's right.
And this part, well, it lays out the incredibly detailed conditions and findings required for certain pipeline projects right here in Santa Barbara County.
Exactly. We're sort of moving past the big environmental impact reports
Yeah.
and getting right into the nuts and bolts. These pages detail the granular requirements, the really specific rules, and the justifications for why those rules were imposed. It shows how the county planned to regulate these huge infrastructure projects,
And manage the potential effects.
right, on the environment, the local communities, everything.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most interesting bits from these, well, pretty dense pages. What were the key concerns? What level of detail did they actually demand?
And what does that tell us about how projects like this are managed? It's less about the grand goals and much more about the specific rules on the ground. The concrete actions, the plans, the stipulations the pipeline operators had to agree to. And it's all tailored to Santa Barbara County based on what's in this exhibit.
Okay, let's jump right in then and start unpacking this for you. So, right at the start, these documents lay out some foundational requirements. For the Los Flores pipeline, for instance, there's the basic acceptance of the permit conditions, basically saying, okay, you accept this permit, you agree to these rules.
Though they could still challenge them legally.
Yeah, exactly. If they felt there was a violation of law or something, the operator kept that right.
And accepting those rules wasn't trivial. For Los Flores, there's a condition, A4, that says the permittee PPC Sable might have to actually fund the county's expenses for implementing and enforcing all these rules.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, that could include paying for studies to monitor impacts or even covering costs if there was an emergency response needed because of enforcement.
So that ties accountability directly to the company financially.
Pretty directly, yeah. It's not just on the taxpayer to oversee it.
Another thing that struck me was how the original project plans, the descriptions and analyses from 83 for Los Flores, they weren't just background info.
Right.
The documents make it clear these become legally binding parts of the permit, A5, I think. They even say that not including these details or deviating without review could cause significant unanticipated environmental impacts.
Right, exactly. It locks in that initial analysis and makes it enforceable. And speaking of enforcement, the county administrative officer got some real teeth.
How so?
Well, for Los Flores, Condition A17 allows the CAO to order the project to stop or scale back if there's reasonable cause to think it's threatening public health, safety, welfare, or the environment.
A curtailment order.
Right. Though, importantly, they did have to give notice and hold a hearing first. Can't just shut it down arbitrarily.
Seems fair. And they even thought about legal fights down the road. I saw something about attorney's fees.
Yeah, A18 for Los Flores. If there was a legal action about enforcing the permit, the winning side could get their attorney's fees and costs covered.
Okay. And these rules applied, what exactly? Just during construction.
No, good point. Unless a condition specifically said otherwise, like in A19 for Los Flores, these rules applied to both construction and the ongoing operation phase. Continuous oversight.
Right, through the life of the project. And finally, a pretty basic but vital one, A23 for Los Flores, requiring a 24-hour contact person.
For emergencies, inquiries, you need someone reachable. Standard practice, but important to mandate.
Okay, so beyond those sort of administrative rules, the documents then really dive deep into specific environmental mitigation. This is where you see what the county was really focused on protecting.
Absolutely. Look at the conditions for Celeron, maybe around page 300 or so. For stream crossings during construction, it wasn't just be careful.
Yeah.
Condition F5 specified minimizing disturbance, narrowing the workspace right down, and actively diverting runoff to keep sediment out of the streams. Very specific actions.
And for streams that flow all year round, perennial streams.
Yeah, for Celeron, Condition F7 required isolation valves installed on both sides of those crossings.
Valves to shut off the flow quickly.
Exactly, to contain any potential leak right there at the sensitive water crossing. Unless, they added, the operator could prove an alternative method would actually reduce the leak impact even further in that specific spot.
Okay, so very targeted safety. What about groundwater? Always a big concern.
Huge concern. Celeron's Condition F9 demanded really comprehensive plans for monitoring and early detection of contamination. We're talking aerial surveys, ground monitoring, pipeline pressure checks, regular water sampling, the works.
And if something was detected?
Detailed notification and cleanup plans had to be ready to go. Plus, Condition F10 required physical protection during trenching near sensitive aquifers, using things like dams or special ditching techniques, especially where groundwater was shallow.
Protecting the water source itself during the build.
Precisely. And then, after construction, restoring the landscape was a major focus. Both Celeron and Las Flores had detailed restoration, erosion control, and revegetation plans required under H1.
I remember seeing a modification date for Las Flores H1J December 92, and H1K mentioned cooperating with state parks for the Gaviota section.
Yes, tailoring it to specific locations. And a really crucial element across these plans. The monitoring had to be done by a qualified independent biologist, not the company's own team, to verify the restoration was actually working.
That independence seems key. It gets even more specific, though, down to individual plans, doesn't it?
It really does. Celeron Condition H9 focused on minimizing impacts to Hoffman's nightshade, Solanum xantivar, Hoffmanii, specifically in the Gaviota Pass area.
What did that involve?
Things like transplanting plants out of the way, collecting seeds, replanting afterwards, all supervised by an approved biologist.
Wow. And there was another one.
Yeah. H11 for Celeron, similar focus, but for Refugia manzanita, Arctostaphylos refugiensis, also in Gaviota Pass, required plans for propagating it from seeds and cuttings to help the population recover.
Really granular stuff. And for Las Flores, I saw Condition H2 required a survey after construction.
A year after, yes.
Yeah.
The company had to fund a survey to see what the actual impact had been, identify spots needing more restoration work, and check how well the initial mitigation had performed. A feedback loop.
Okay. And H24 for Las Flores dealt with temporary work areas.
Right. Minimize vegetation removal as much as possible in those temporary spaces. And on steep slopes, over 30%, restoration and revegetation had to happen immediately once the space wasn't needed, with specific rules about soil placement, quick recovery on sensitive slopes.
These projects obviously bring in workers and activity impacting the local community. How did the documents address those socioeconomic effects?
They did cover that. For Celeron, around page 309, there was a socioeconomic monitoring and mitigation program, conditions I1 and I2. The idea was to track impacts and then trigger mitigation if certain levels were exceeded.
What kind of mitigation?
Well, some were quite specific. Condition I2B for Celeron encouraged housing workers outside the immediate South Coast area, especially during peak tourist season.
How would they encourage that?
The document mentions potentially using incentives like rent subsidies or even shuttle services, trying to ease pressure on local housing.
Interesting. And I remember seeing something about campgrounds too, I2C.
Yeah, aimed at limiting project worker use of public campgrounds. It even included a potential mechanism for the company to donate to state or county parks based on campsite costs if monitoring showed significant impact from their workers using the campgrounds.
Trying to offset the burden, scheduling was also mentioned, I3 for Celeron.
Right. Generally required construction to avoid peak tourist seasons. But there was a caveat. Unless that conflicted with other critical timing, like needing low stream flows for crossings, it was a balancing act.
And if there was a conflict?
Then additional measures for worker housing might be required.
Okay. And to maybe reduce the impact of workers moving in, Condition I5 for Celeron encouraged hiring local labor.
Yes, prioritizing local employment was encouraged to minimize impacts from immigration.
What about public services or just basic property access? Fences being cut, that kind of thing?
Address that too. Celeron Condition J7 had detailed rules for dealing with fences or barriers, required giving property owners advance notice, making sure the fence's function, like keeping livestock in, was replaced before the cut, and then fully restoring it afterward.
Practical stuff. Road impacts must have been a big concern too. Lots of heavy equipment.
Definitely. Celeron Condition K5 required a detailed plan, approved by County Public Works. It had to spell out the types of vehicles, how often they'd be used, their weights, all specifically for county roads.
And who pays for damage?
The plan had to include an agreement for the company to repair any project-caused damage, and potentially even pay fees if their heavy use led to the need for road reconstruction.
So the county needed to list the roads.
Right. Coordination was required, and if private roads were involved, they needed approval from the property owner or even the court.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly, what about protecting historical sites or cultural resources?
A significant focus. For Celeron, Condition L1 mandated cultural resources surveys, first a Phase I walkover, then potentially a Phase II assessment of site importance. The goal was always avoidance where feasible.
Unless
Avoiding the site caused overriding safety issues or unavoidable impacts to critical habitats. but avoidance was the priority.
And I saw a fascinating detail, L3 for Celeron, about a pre-construction workshop.
Yes, specifically with Native American consultants to review mutual concerns about the project route and the work itself. A direct consultation step.
That's important. And during construction.
Condition L4 for Celeron required both an archaeologist and a Native American representative to be present on site during ground-disturbing activities.
And if something unexpected was found, like burials, L6.
Clear protocol. Stop all excavation and disturbance immediately in that area. Then they had to follow specific procedures laid out in CEQA Appendix K and county guidelines before any work could resume there. Very strict process.
Okay. What about visual impacts? Big pump stations, pipelines?
Addressed under visual resources. M1 for both Celeron and Las Flores required facility designs, pump stations, landscaping, signs to be approved by the County Board of Architectural Review, the BIR.
Based on local rules.
Exactly, based on specific county ordinance sections about aesthetics. And for Celeron, M1 also required consulting with affected property owners about visual screening options along the pipeline route itself.
And then a practical step, M4 for both projects.
Right, painting. Pump stations and any above-ground pipeline sections had to be painted before operation, using colors approved to help them blend in with the surroundings. Las Flores M4 specifically mentioned the Gaviota and Sisquoc pump stations.
Makes sense. What about noise? Construction and operation noise can be a big issue.
Definitely. Both Celeron N1 and Las Flores N1 required a noise monitoring and control plan, approved by the relevant county departments.
Did they set specific limits?
Yes, quite specific. N3 and N4 for both projects aimed to minimize noise between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. at sensitive spots like Gaviota State Park, near Vista Del Mar School, and Buellton.
And nighttime?
Critically, between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., noise was limited to 50 dBA LDN at the nearest sensitive locations. That's pretty quiet, like a quiet conversation or a fridge hum. A significant restriction.
So, limited nighttime work noise. And they had to tell people.
Yes. Notification to residents within 1,200 feet was required before noisy construction started. And for Las Flores, N3 also restricted blasting to daytime hours, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
Okay, perhaps the most critical aspect, system safety and reliability. How did these documents ensure the pipelines were safe?
This was clearly paramount.
Yeah.
For Celeron, P1 established a System Safety and Reliability Review Committee, or SSRRC.
Who's on it?
Various county departments, fire, resource management, public works, environmental health. Their job was to review design hazards, looking at process diagrams, potentially bringing in a third-party expert.
And their recommendations.
Had to be incorporated into the design. Celeron had to foot the bill for this review process, but could participate.
What about Las Flores safety review? P1.
For Las Flores, the SSRRC review findings were shared with Celeron. Interestingly, if Celeron disagreed with the county on certain technical safety points covered by federal regulations, the document noted the county's recourse might be with the federal DOT Office of Pipeline Safety.
So a multi-layered review. What about ongoing safety, inspection, maintenance? P2.
Both projects required a detailed safety inspection, maintenance, and quality assurance program covering both construction and operations, again reviewed by the SSRRC or consultants. Celeron funded the county consultant involvement.
And for Las Flores?
P2 for Las Flores specifically required Celeron PPC to fund a full-time pipeline inspector during construction, either from the U.S. DOT or an approved representative, an independent eye during the build.
Crucial. And emergency response, P3 for Celeron.
Absolutely essential. Mandated a detailed emergency response plan. Had to cover procedures for accidents affecting the community or environment based on a risk analysis that the SSRRC reviewed.
When did this plan need approval?
Prior to startup, County Emergency Services, Fire, and Resource Management all had to review and sign off before oil could flow.
Now tell me about those surprise drills again. That sounds fascinating. P3 for Celeron.
It really is. The condition required Celeron to prove their plan worked by responding effectively to up to one surprise drill per year initiated by the county.
Where could these drills happen?
Anywhere on pump station property, along the pipeline route, even along Highway 101. And separately, they had to demonstrate their oil spill response capability with another surprise drill each year.
Wow, that's pretty intensive testing. Really puts them on the spot.
Keeps them ready, presumably. And one last safety-related one, P16 for Celeron, involved future planning.
Yes, it required Celeron to designate alternative pipeline routes to specifically avoid two potential future school sites the local district was studying at the time, Rada Park and Tajiga's Ranch.
So, proactive avoidance of future conflicts.
Right. The county had to review and approve those avoidance routes. Okay, so after pages and pages of these incredibly specific conditions, the document gets to the formal findings required for approval. Basically, the county justifying its decision.
Right.
Around page 316 for Celeron.
Exactly. These are the formal statements explaining why, given all the analysis and the conditions imposed, the project could be approved. Many were carried over from previous approvals, but modified.
There were findings for both a development plan and a conditional use permit.
Yes. The findings for the conditional use permit were mostly identical to the development plan ones. But finding 9 added a check for consistency with the zoning district, concluding pipelines needing major permits were consistent with zoning, even in sensitive habitats.
And there was a specific finding about the Buellton route alternatives explaining the choice, page 317.
Right. It spells out why the chosen western route was preferred over eastern options. Less disruption to Buellton's commercial areas, less inconvenience to residents,
Lower risk to the water supply.
lower likelihood of contaminating the water supply if a spill happened, yes, and disturbing less sensitive habitat overall compared to the eastern routes. The finding explicitly says the eastern routes were found more environmentally damaging.
So a clear rationale laid out. Now, after all this, are these conditions completely fixed, set in stone forever?
Not necessarily, and that's a really important point, especially highlighted in Condition B2 for the Los Flores system under Exhibit D. It allows for future review and potential modification of the conditions.
Under what circumstances?
If monitoring shows the conditions aren't working well enough, if they're found inadequate, or critically, if proven technological advances offer better ways to mitigate impacts.
So there's a mechanism for updating.
Yes. It specifically required a comprehensive review 3 years after the permit was issued and periodically after that. Plus, reviews could happen anytime if monitoring indicated problems. It builds in adaptability.
Wow. Okay, looking back at pages 288 through 345 then, that was an incredibly deep dive into the weeds of regulatory requirements. I mean, from funding county oversight and protecting specific individual plants like Hoffman's nightshade, to requiring archaeologists on site and staging surprise safety drills.
Ah.
These pages show a truly, truly granular approach.
It really does illustrate how, for these major industrial projects in a sensitive area like Santa Barbara County, the regulatory framework wasn't just about broad goals. It translated those goals into very concrete, measurable, and enforceable requirements.
Touching almost every aspect of the project.
Yeah, reflecting this detailed effort to balance the need for energy infrastructure with protecting the local environment and community, all based on the specifics laid out right here in this exhibit.
This dive into just these pages gives us, and hopefully you, a unique look at the practical reality of coastal planning. Not just the vision, but the painstaking details of how it gets implemented through these project-specific conditions.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, drawn just from what we've discussed in these pages. Considering this extensive list of highly specific conditions, and especially that provision we just mentioned for future reviews based on monitoring and technological advances, does the framework presented right here in this document suggest a regulatory process that is designed, perhaps intentionally, to continuously adapt over the long term to the challenge of managing these complex industrial impacts?
Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the documents.